Good morning or whatever time it is. I'm Mr. DiRomualdo,
And I'm Mr. Elder.
and we're going to quickly go through a screencast of the powers of the president. You'll notice on the PowerPoint right away that there's an essential question that we want you to look at, and that would be to evaluate the roles of the president. Many of you probably have had lessons on this before, but it was simplified in terms of the many hats the president wears. Chances are we're going to probably expand upon that, but this time in a more constitutional sense.
As we go through, we're going to be referencing things in your reader in Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the first reading in the second unit of your Marking Period 1 reader. So if you want to follow along and highlight those things and try to find the language that we're pointing to, that would be a really good idea so that you can clarify where in Article 2 these things are. Another comment before we get into it is if we say Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, that means that it's the second paragraph in Article 2, Section 1. So if you're confused by what we mean by clause, you can substitute clause in this case for paragraph right now while you're following along.
The first set of powers of the president are executive. So if you remember back to when we were talking about the etymology of a term, right? This is their executive powers, their power to execute laws, right? So you'll see the very first box says execute powers. That is a constitutional provision. So Article 2 is essentially all about that. You can find evidence of executive powers throughout Article 2, so on page 9 or 10. Some specifics are underneath it, whereby you could say carry out all federal laws. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1, page 9. First paragraph. It is right there in Section 1, first paragraph. It'll tell you exactly what they are supposed to do.
And that's also where you find the term, the amount of years per term for the president in Section 1, Clause 1 of Article 2. The president also has powers to create executive orders or to issue executive orders, which are orders from the president that don't necessarily have to go through Congress, but there's a gray area between whether or not they are law or what the power of the executive actually is. And that's found in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. So that second paragraph in Article 2, Section 2 establishes that executives can have these executive orders. And there's a long history of presidents issuing executive orders. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has the most executive orders by far as president. Some common examples of executive orders that you may have heard of. One of those would be Japanese internment during World War II. That was an executive order from Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time, who was president during the beginning of World War II. And also DACA, which you may have heard of, has been in the news recently. So that is an executive order, and there was a lot of controversy over DACA when President Obama issued that executive order, whether it was constitutional or not, whether it was overstepping the bounds of what an executive order should be. So if you pay attention to that, there have been plenty of examples of executive orders in the past.
Now, to be a little bit more nuanced, some of you have probably wondered, for example, whether the memoranda from President Trump to ban transgender troops from the armed forces is that an executive order? Well, the answer is no. There's actually three classifications of statements or proclamations of sorts that the president can make. The first is literally that. I think it is, what was it actually called again? I forget now. I just had it. Oh no.
Presidential instead of proclamation.
It is a proclamation.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just said it. The first categorization is a proclamation. That is the highest order of all of them. The second is a executive order, which Mr. Elder just talked about in a little bit more detail. And then the last is a memorandum, and it's in that order of precedence. All of them technically take law until otherwise proven constitutional or not. And all of them have the force of law. So, Trump can say in a memo that he'd like something to happen, or any president could say in a memo that they'd like something to happen, and it would be up to the Justice Department to then take action on it, or Congress. So, you can prompt Congress to make a law, or he can get his Justice Department to act in a certain way.
The next power that we're going to discuss is the appointment power. And when presidents take office, usually you hear a lot about the appointment power because there are a lot of positions in government which need to be filled, theoretically, to have a functioning government in the United States. And so the president appoints people like the Secretary of State, like the Attorney General, and other cabinet positions and federal positions that help the government run. There is a limitation on this appointment power, though, and if you were paying attention in the early spring and spring of last year, there were a lot of Senate confirmation hearings. So the Senate has to actually approve these positions with a 2/3 vote. So 2/3 of the Senate, you can do the math on that one, has to approve the people that the president actually goes to appoint before they can take office.
Lastly, on this slide, you'll see the removal power, and technically this is not in the Constitution, but Congress has given the president broad powers to actually get rid of people, that is to say, remove them from office. More often than not, it's probably going to be a judge because, they are there for a lifetime position, and chances are they may do something. They're more likely to do something deemed illegal, I suppose, if that's the word, but a removable offense. In this case, though, I wanted to mention that, for example, Donald Trump recently and somewhat controversially removed James Comey, the former FBI director, from his office. He has every right to do that thanks to congressional approval of those measures.
So we want you to take some time, and we're not going to hold you to a strict time here because you're doing this on your own, but we want you to answer the following questions in your reader, or excuse me, in your notebook. I should change that to say in your notebook. So we want you to, 1, define executive order, and please refer to Article 2 of the Constitution for that. Number 2, what is the ordinance power, or where does the ordinance power come from? And 3, identify 5 appointments a president can make according to the Constitution. Okay, please use Article 2 of the Constitution for those first 3 questions. The 4th question you will have to do a little bit of research for. There's a Supreme Court case called Myers versus the United States. So we want you to give a basic summary, pretty short summary of what that court ruling was and why it was significant.
Chances are, for number 4, you can use a website like Oyez, Oyez, in order to find a very brief summary of the court case.
All right, so we're back from you working on those questions, and we have the answers here. We'll run through some of them for you. The first question was about an executive order.
So, by all technical definitions, an executive order is a directive, rule, or regulation that has the effect of law. So, a president can sign an order, and therefore, it will become part of a regulation and take the effect of law. So, it circumvents Congress.
The second question was, where does the ordinance power come from? And the ordinance power is given to the president by the Constitution and acts of Congress that determine what the president's power essentially actually is and what it means.
Third is to identify at least 5 appointments a president can make. And in this case, it's fairly straightforward. Ambassadors, diplomats, cabinet members, and their aides, heads of independent agencies, federal judges, U.S. Marshals, attorneys, officers in the armed forces. All of these are powers of the president, and they can specifically be found in Article 2, Section 2. And Clause 1 mainly, however, I think you can look through Section 2 a bit, and you can find the ability for the president to appoint.
And the last question was on Myers versus the United States, and why that Supreme Court case was significant and what the ruling was. The significance really is that the power of removal was an essential part of the executive powers, and that executive powers are necessary powers for the president to have in order to execute the laws of the land. So very simply, we could talk for a little bit longer about that Supreme Court case, but that's generally what that was about.
Next up in the presidential hats, so to speak, would be his diplomatic powers as the, chief of state or the head of state. The first of his powers that you could probably look at is the ability to make treaties with nations. You will notice, first off, that almost all of these have limitations. So the president might be able to make a treaty, which can be found in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, but it will require 2/3 of the Senate to approve it. And you can find, like I said, the limitation on it in the exact same place that you found his ability to make treaties, and that would be Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 on page 10.
The next diplomatic power is for the president to appoint ambassadors to other countries, also in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. And ambassadors are there for the United States to keep relationships with other countries steady. The president can't talk to all other executives all the time. So ambassadors are kind of like the middleman in relaying the messages of one country to another country and vice versa. The Senate has to confirm the ambassadors that are appointed by the president, and you find that limitation, that fourth column is the constitutional provision for the limitation. That's also in the same spot in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2.
The third power on this slide is called the power of recognition, and you might be scratching your head and wondering what that actually has to do with. It's actually quite simple. If you think about diplomatic powers, you want to look at who are we actually talking to, or what is a diplomat? So if he's our chief diplomat, the president, that means he has the power to recognize states, and so he might, for example, recognize a country that is asking for, to be recognized as a sovereign entity in the world. Some notable examples that I can personally think of was the South Sudan in the not-so-distant past, and then pictured is George W. Bush doing something.
Yes.
I thought you were pointing to him for a reason.
No, so power of recognition also includes the president's ability to receive other diplomats personally. Another example that Mr. DiRomualdo was talking about could be Taiwan, whether or not the United States actually recognizes and will host diplomats from Taiwan, which is a very contentious topic for the Taiwanese and the Chinese governments. The final power of diplomacy, as far as the president is concerned, is that he is the commander-in-chief. And that's right in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. You've probably heard that phrase before, the commander-in-chief, and that means that the United States is the chief officer in the Army, the Navy, and other military organizations of the United States. There is a limitation on that, though. The president cannot declare war. Let me say that again. The president cannot declare war alone. Congress has to actually declare war, and Congress is the one who appropriates or gives out the money for the military and makes sure that the money is being spent appropriately. And that constitutional provision is found in Article 1, which you don't have in front of you, but Article 1, Section 8, Clause number 11 is where the appropriation of funds for the military would be found.
The second set of questions we would like you to answer are as follows. They pertain to what we just talked about, but we want you to get into a little bit more detail with this and answer them in your notebook. The first question is going to ask you to define what a treaty actually is. Secondly, what does the recognition of other sovereign nations signify? Well, in other words, why is it important when a president recognizes another sovereign nation? Thirdly, does the Constitution give the president power to use the military without a declaration of war by Congress? Provide 4 examples. So you're going to find examples. You probably know of examples where the president has used the military without a declaration of war. Is there any justification for that use found in the Constitution? So you got to get specific with the Constitution.
There's something called the War Powers Resolution as well, and we want you to find the 3 central provisions of that War Power Resolution. And then, as the final question, determine what event actually caused Congress to pass that War Powers Resolution in the first place. We're not going to go question by question and go over the answers because these are more discussion questions for us to have. So you're not going to find the answers to these questions right now, but we will go over some of these as we dive a little bit further into Article 2 and the powers of the president.
Last but not least, as far as the powers of the president is concerned, would be the legislative and judicial powers. So this is where the president assumes the ability to do what the other branches of governments do, or to check the ability of or powers of the legislative and judicial branches. First, we'll start with legislative. The president can recommend legislation. You probably hear a lot about Congress turning to the president to define an agenda, talk about his agenda. Most people talk about, for example, President Trump. They say, well, his agenda was first to appeal Obamacare, and now they really want to turn to tax reform. And that is something that the president really tries to push. You could find that information, Article 2, Section 3 in the Constitution. However, the limitation exists that Congress actually has to pass something. So you could find that, and though it's not in front of you, that limitation is posted in Article 1, Section 1 in the Constitution.
The president also has to do something with every bill that is given to him and passed through Congress. There are a few different actions that the president can take, and those powers are outlined in Article 1, which, again, you don't have in front of you, but Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2, says that the president can sign a bill into law, right? If the bill is passed to the president, he can sign it into law. However, there is a limitation on that from the Supreme Court. You've probably heard the phrase checks and balances. So the Supreme Court has the power to determine that a law is unconstitutional or goes against the law of the land. That constitutional power from the judicial branch is found in Article 3, Section 2, Clause 1.
The next step a president could take is something you're probably familiar with, which is simply saying no to a bill. The way we would say that in constitutional terms would be vetoing a bill. You could find that power in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2. You'll note that the president's power to veto is in Article 1 as opposed to the definition of Article 2 being the executive powers, because this is the president using a check on Congress. Please note also that Congress can override a veto of any bill with 2/3 of the vote. So that's, quite a substantial amount. 66% of all of Congress, both the House and the Senate, have to say we want to override this. So it does not happen very often when a president chooses to veto a bill. You could find constitutional provisions for the two-thirds override in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 as well.
The final action that the president can take is sometimes viewed as inaction, but inaction is still action, right? If you're intentionally choosing to not act on something, that is an action that you're taking, even though it's the absence of an action, which I know sounds confusing, but this power is called the pocket veto. So in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2, once again, the president can choose not to do anything with that bill that's passed to him. And it will or won't become law, depending on if Congress is in session or not, which is kind of confusing, but the timing is really important. So if Congress is not in session 10 days after the bill is passed to the president, and the president just essentially puts it in his pocket, right, and forgets about it, slips it in his desk and forgets about it, then it does not become law. And that constitutional provision for that limitation is in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 as well. But if Congress is in session, then it becomes a law. If Congress is still working and the president just decides not to do anything, it does become a law. So it's the timing of a pocket veto is very tricky, and it can go one way or the other depending on if Congress is actually working or not.
Yeah, important thing to note, at least historically speaking, a lot gets done in a congressional session in the last 10 days. So you actually see pocket vetoes happen fairly frequently, despite seeming very despite seeming like a very minor power of the president. It's there for a reason. Mm-hmm. The last thing we wanted to add in this slideshow is the issue of pardons. You probably heard about this if you've been paying attention to the media at all. For the very recent pardoning of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, regardless of your feelings one way or the other about that pardon, it was the use of a pardon, and a rare early pardon from a president. Much like the pocket veto, you usually see these types of things happen towards the end of someone's session or term. Pardons you typically occurred late in a presidential term, and usually it's controversial. But to get into the actual power itself, you have the ability as a president to roll back someone's punishment. You can also actually just kind of limit the sentencing if you want to as well. So, for example, Obama what's the word I'm looking for? It's like commuted the sentence of many minor drug offenses. He also commuted the sentence of the whistleblower Chelsea Manning. But then, you could just use a straight pardon and forgive someone of a crime or a perceived crime. Probably the most famous pardon in all of presidential history came from President Gerald Ford, who pardoned President Nixon immediately after he resigned from the presidency for clear violations of the law. You can find this information in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. The limits are that only a pardon for a federal crime can happen. So if you commit a state crime, you can't really a president really has no business pardoning someone who just simply commits a local or state offense.
Important to note, a lot of you may have thought that President Nixon was impeached. He was not impeached. He resigned before he could get impeached. So that's why Gerald Ford had the ability to pardon him, because Section 2 of Article 2 says that he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States except in cases of impeachment, like Mr. DiRomualdo already said. So Nixon wasn't impeached. He was going to be, but then he quit.
Finally, we have one more set of questions for you, which we will be going over in a more discussion-based sense, but we would like you to answer these in your academic journals. The first is, what is a line item veto? So we talked to you about pocket vetoes, and we talked to you about a regular veto, but what's a line item veto.
The next question revolves around another Supreme Court case called Clinton versus New York City in 1988. We want you to kind of give another brief summary of the decision of the Supreme Court. What was generally the case about? What was the decision of the Supreme Court? And as Mr. DiRomualdo said earlier, OYES is a good place to go for that. OYES is a good resource for Supreme Court cases and court cases in general.
The third question asks you to define what the pardon is, specifically in your own language, and give a famous example of a presidential pardon. We would like you to use one that is not any of the things that we just told you. So come up with something interesting, I would say, as opposed to just regurgitating what we just told you about both Nixon or Ford's pardon of Nixon or the Sheriff Joe Arpaio examples.
And the final two questions revolve around two terms that are similar but definitely not the same. Two words called clemency and amnesty. And we'd like you to give two examples of what amnesty is and how amnesty has worked in the United States in the past. So this has been our screencast of presidential powers, both executive, diplomatic, and legislative. If you have any questions about these, please come and ask us.
I don't have anything else to add.
Okay.
So, thank you very much for listening.
And we'll see you in class.
Yes.